Have you ever wondered what keeps a human alive, long after logic has already buried them? Not the body, not the mind. Something deeper, that infuriating, irrational spark that refuses to fade even when the universe itself looks away. The Threx Empire built their prisons to erase identity. No names, no sunlight, no sound but the machines. 400 days of cold, hunger, and silence, enough to break any rational creature. But Corporal Miles Carter was never rational. He sang when he should have screamed. He laughed when he should have begged. And when every other species surrendered to despair. He carved symbols in the dirt and whispered names the galaxy had already forgotten. To the Threx, it was madness. To us, it was humanity. Because humans don't survive by strength alone. They survive by stubbornness, by the quiet, impossible decision to exist, even when existence no longer makes sense. Before we begin, subscribe, like, and tell me from which city or planet you're watching this. This story isn't about how one man survived. It's about why he refused to stop being human. Corporal Miles Carter stood in the center of the Threx detention compound, hands zip-tied behind his back, and did something that made every guard's reptilian eyes widen in confusion. He smiled. Not a grimace, not defiance. A genuine, tired smile as the temperature plummeted to -15 Celsius around him. His breath came in visible clouds. Blood from a split lip froze on his chin, and he smiled. Observer Ross Kell, a young Threx scientist assigned to document the human prisoner's inevitable breakdown, adjusted his bioscanner 3 times. The readings made no sense. Pain receptors firing, hypothermia setting in, muscle tremors indicating severe distress, and yet the human's heart rate remained steady, controlled, as if he'd decided cold was merely uncomfortable rather than life-threatening. The Threx didn't understand. They couldn't. Their species had conquered 40 star systems through calculated brutality and pure physical dominance. When they'd captured the human during the Battle of Signia 4 3 days ago, they'd expected a quick study. Humans were death welders, yes, but still flesh, still breakable. Commander Vex Thule had filed the initial report with clinical precision. Prisoner H247, human designation Miles Carter. Species classification Death Welder, planet Earth rated class D12 for extreme environmental hostility. Expected collaboration timeline, 72 hours under standard interrogation protocols. The Threx Empire had processed 300,000 prisoners of war across a dozen species. Humans would be no different. But Carter had now been singing the same song for 40 minutes straight. Some ancient tune about sunshine and happiness in sub-zero temperatures, while 6 other prisoners from various species shivered in silence, awaiting their daily interrogation. The compound itself was designed with mathematical cruelty. Temperatures fluctuated between extremes every 6 hours, freezing to scorching, scorching to freezing. Food rations calculated to provide exactly 600 calories daily, half of what a human needed to survive. The machines never stopped. 90 decibels of grinding mechanical noise, 18 hours every day, preventing sleep and thought in equal measure. Carter had arrived on day 1 with 13 other humans. By day 3, only he remained. The others had been separated, sent to different facilities, or so the Threx claimed. Carter didn't believe them. 14 humans had died in this camp before he arrived. He'd found their names scratched into the walls of his cell. Rodriguez, Liu, O'Brien, Tanaka. 14 names he repeated every night before sleep found him in 30-minute increments between the machine cycles. On day 23, something shifted. Carter made a joke. A stupid, terrible joke about the food tasting like his ex-wife's cooking. A Zethian prisoner, a fragile insectoid species, actually laughed. A clicking, chittering sound that made the Threx guards look over in confusion. It was the first time anyone had laughed in that compound in 8 months. Roskell noted it in his log. Anomalous behavior. Human demonstrates humor response under duress. Psychological purpose, unclear. By day 45, the interrogations had begun in earnest. Commander Vex Thule himself attended, his scaled face impassive as he offered Carter a tray of actual food, real protein, fresh water. All Carter had to do was provide tactical information about human fleet movements in Sector 7. Carter looked at the food for exactly 8 seconds. His hands trembled, not from cold or fear, but from hunger so profound his body was consuming its own muscle mass. He'd lost 18 kilograms in 6 weeks. "You wouldn't understand," Carter said, his voice hoarse from dehydration and the songs he sang to keep his mind intact. Vex Thule's translator unit struggled with the phrase. The words were simple, but the meaning seemed to slip through the logic circuits like water through scales. "Explain," Vex Thule demanded. Carter met his eyes. "If I tell you, I'm just another prisoner who broke. If I don't, I'm still me. And right now, being me is the only thing I've got left." The food was removed. Carter was given a shovel instead. "Dig your grave," the guard said. Standard intimidation. Except Carter used the shovel to carve something into the hard-packed ground of the exercise yard, the eagle, globe, and anchor symbol of the Earth Marines Corps. 3 feet wide, perfect proportions. It took him 6 hours. His hands bled, and when the guards tried to erase it, he smiled that same impossible smile. "You can cover it," he said, "but I know it's there." By day 67, something unprecedented happened. Roskel, while supervising the evening water distribution, poured an extra 200 milliliters into Carter's cup when the security cameras cycled. Just 200 milliliters, barely a difference. Carter looked up at him, said nothing, drank the water. But something passed between them in that moment. A crack in the armor, the first fissure in Threk's certainty. That night, Carter sang a different song. Softer. Something about being a long way from home. Roskel, reviewing the audio logs later, felt something he had no word for. The translation called it sadness, but that seemed incomplete. Humans, he was learning, felt things in layers the Threk's language couldn't capture. On day 89, Carter's world exploded, literally. A sonic device malfunctioned during interrogation, hitting 130 decibels at close range for 4 seconds. The medical scanner later showed 38% hearing loss in his left ear. Permanent. Carter woke in his cell 16 hours later, head pounding, blood dried on his neck. The machines were running. He couldn't hear them properly anymore. Everything sounded underwater, distant. For the first time since arrival, he considered that he might not make it out, that this might be where Miles Carter ended. He lay there for 3 minutes. Then he started singing again, louder than before, because he couldn't hear himself properly. Off-key and defiant. Because giving up, as he would tell Roskel 200 days later, was a habit, and Miles Carter didn't like bad habits. Commander Vex Thule updated his report that evening. Prisoner H-247 demonstrates psychological resilience outside known parameters. Recommendation: increase pressure systematically. Note: human appears to use vocalization as emotional regulation mechanism. Purpose remains illogical but effective. This is troubling. What the Threks couldn't know, what their reports and sensors and mathematical models of suffering could never capture, was simple. Carter wasn't strong because he was fearless. He was terrified. Every day, every frozen night and scorching afternoon, he sang not from courage but from desperation. The songs kept the panic at bay, kept him human when everything was designed to strip that away. And in his cell that night, with damaged hearing and a body breaking down one system at a time, Carter pulled out a small piece of metal he'd hidden from the guards. He scratched a mark on the wall. Day 89. Then below it, 13 more marks for the humans who died before him. He whispered their names. "I'm still here," he said to the empty air. "You're not forgotten." The machines ground on. The temperature began to drop. And somewhere in the command center, Roskel stared at his monitor, watching the human's biometrics, and thought something he would never voice aloud. What if strength isn't what we thought it was? But that thought was dangerous. So he filed his report, classified the data, and tried to forget the sound of Carter's off-key singing echoing through the compound like a ghost that refused to die. Day 100 approached, and the real test, both men knew without saying, was only beginning. On day 112, the Threx installed biometric sensors throughout Carter's cell. Every heartbeat, every breath, every spike of adrenaline or drop in blood pressure. They were done guessing. They wanted data. Roskel supervised the installation, his clawed hands checking each sensor with methodical precision. Carter watched from his corner, saying nothing. The human had learned when to fight and when to conserve energy. This was a conservation moment. "Why do you sing?" Roskel asked suddenly. The question violated protocol. Guards didn't converse with prisoners beyond commands. Carter took his time answering. "My grandmother taught me. She said music was the one thing nobody could take away. Turns out she was right." Roskel's head tilted, a gesture that in Threk's body language indicated processing of confusing data. "Your grandmother, an elder female. She prioritized cultural transmission of non-essential acoustic patterns over tactical survival information. She taught me that survival isn't just breathing. It's remembering who you are while you do it." The concept made Roskel's scales itch with discomfort. Threk's culture had no equivalent. Identity was fixed: warrior, worker, scientist. You were assigned your role, you fulfilled it. There was no question of remembering yourself because there was nothing to remember. You simply were what the hierarchy determined you to be. That night, Roskel accessed the Galactic Codex entry on Deathworld's species. He'd read it before, but now the words carried different weight. Planets classified D10 through D12 produce species with exceptional resistance to environmental stresses. Humans from Earth, a Class D12 world, demonstrate aggressive immune systems, high toxin tolerance, and ability to function under extreme deprivation. Note: human psychological resilience exceeds mathematical models. Cause unknown, cause unknown. Roskel stared at those words for 3 minutes. By day 134, Carter had done something the Threx found genuinely disturbing. He'd taught 4 other prisoners, 3 different species, to sing "You Are My Sunshine" in rough harmony. The Zethian's clicking voice, the Gorland's deep rumble, a Vespin's whistling tones, and Carter's damaged hearing human voice. It was objectively terrible. The harmonies were wrong, the rhythm inconsistent, and yet every prisoner in range stopped to listen. Music, Roskel noted in his log, appears to function as social bonding mechanism without hierarchical structure. No leader, no follower, just collective vocalization. The report went to Commander Vex Thule with a red flag. Prisoner H-247 is contaminating other species with human behavioral patterns. The Threx response was immediate. Isolation. 14 days in complete darkness. No sound except the drip of condensation. No human contact. The cell was 2 meters by 2 meters. Carter couldn't stand fully upright. Couldn't lie flat. Just crouch and exist. On day 3 of isolation, Carter started talking to himself. Not singing. Talking. Telling stories about Earth. About Texas summers and Michigan winters. About his niece's 4th birthday when she'd demanded 17 hugs exactly, no more, no less. About coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of burnt dirt. Roskel listened through the audio feed, fasciating and horrified in equal measure. The human was creating sensory experiences through pure vocalization. Building worlds from words. It was, by Threx standards, a form of temporary insanity. Except Carter came out on day 14 more centered than when he'd entered. "Did that make you stronger?" Roskel asked during the medical check, unable to help himself. Carter's damaged hearing meant Roskel had to repeat the question. Then Carter smiled that maddening smile. "Nah, just reminded me why I'm still fighting. On day 145, Commander Vex Thule made Carter an offer that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 10 prisoners, all species, all scheduled for execution in a week. Give us tactical data on human fleet positions in Sector 7. Nothing critical, just routine patrol patterns, and we spare all 10. Carter looked at the list of names. Prisoner designations, really. But he'd learned some of them. The Zethian who'd laughed at his terrible joke. The Gorlan who shared condensation water when Carter was too weak to collect his own. How do I know you'll keep your word? You don't, but refusal is certainty of death. Cooperation is possibility of life. Carter stood there for 90 seconds. His hands shook, not from cold this time, but from the weight of choosing. Finally, he shook his head. Can't do it. Vex Thule's eyes narrowed. You value abstract loyalty over concrete lives? I value not being the reason more humans die. You want those fleet positions so you can ambush patrols. How many humans die if I talk? 20? 50? Perhaps none. Perhaps we merely want information. And I'm supposed to gamble with my brother's lives on perhaps. 3 days later, 3 prisoners died. Cause of death listed as environmental exposure. Carter found out through whispered conversations in the exercise yard. He added their names to his wall that night, carved below the original 14. His hands shook so badly he could barely grip the metal shard. He'd made a choice. Logic said he'd chosen correctly. His heart said he'd killed 3 beings who'd done nothing except exist in the wrong place. That was the first time Roskel saw Carter cry. Not during torture, not in isolation, but alone in his cell at night, tracing names on a wall, shoulders shaking silently. Crying not from breaking, but from staying intact, from being human enough to grieve choices that had no right answers. The Threx had a word for grief: data loss acknowledgement, recognizing that something which once existed no longer did. But watching Carter, Roskel understood their word was insufficient. Humans didn't just acknowledge loss, they carried it, transformed it into something that looked like weakness, but functioned as memory. On day 167, the Threx tried something crueler than any physical torture. They told Carter the Earth had fallen, that the war was over, that he was the last human alive, stranded in a galaxy that had moved on. Carter went very still. Prove it. They showed him falsified news broadcasts, destroyed cities, surrendered documents with human signatures. It was masterful propaganda, built from intercepted intelligence and deep fake technology. 94% of tested subjects believed it immediately. Carter watched it all. Then he started singing Amazing Grace, the hymn his grandmother had taught him, the one they'd sung at her funeral when he was 11. Why do you sing now? Vex Thule demanded, genuinely confused. Because my grandma always said grace was what you found in the darkest places. And this place is pretty goddamn dark. The falsified Earthfall report went into Roskel's log with a note. Subject appears to have emotional defense mechanism that translates despair into ritualized vocalization. This permits continued function despite psychological devastation. Recommend further study. But privately, Roskel thought something else. He thought, what if faith isn't stupidity? What if hope isn't just failed probability calculation? On day 189, Carter was given a PAR during exercise period. The same PAR they'd given him to dig his own grave on day 45. This time, he used it to carve the Marine Corps symbol even larger. 4 feet across, deep enough that rain couldn't wash it away. A guard tried to stop him. Carter didn't resist, didn't fight. He just kept carving, methodical and patient, until the guard physically pulled him away. The symbol was 3/4 complete. The next day, Carter was back with the PA. He finished it. Roskel asked him, "Why does that symbol matter so much?" Carter's response was simple. "Because I promised I'd never forget who I was. And that symbol is a promise that someone, somewhere, is still looking for me." Even if it's not true, believing it keeps me breathing. By day 214, something had fundamentally shifted in Roskel. He began leaving small things for Carter, an extra ration pack hidden in the wall, a piece of cloth that could be used to cover the sensor, giving Carter privacy for 90 seconds at a time. Nothing big, nothing that would be noticed. Except it was noticed. On day 231, a guard caught Roskel adding 10% more water to Carter's daily ration. The guard reported it. Roskel was called before a review board. "Why did you violate protocol?" Roskel searched for the right words. "I wanted to understand if compassion had tactical application." "And your conclusion?" "Insufficient data to determine." They let him continue his work with a warning, but Roskel knew the truth. He hadn't violated protocol for data. He'd done it because watching Carter suffer had started to feel wrong. Not inefficient, not illogical, wrong. And the Threx language had no word for that kind of wrong. On day 250, the reports from the camp reached a critical mass. The Threx High Command reviewed observer Roskel's logs, Commander Vex Thul's interrogation summaries, and the behavioral data from all prisoners. A pattern emerged. Prisoners in Carter's proximity showed increased resistance to interrogation. They sang. They told stories. They created symbols. The report's conclusion was damning. Human cultural practices function as psychological contagion. Recommend immediate isolation of subject H247 or termination. But termination would mean admitting that a single human prisoner had defeated the Threx detention system through nothing but stubborn persistence. And the Threx Empire did not admit defeat, so instead they decided to break him properly. Systematically. Scientifically. Phase 3 was about to begin, and neither Carter nor Roskel knew that the worst was yet to come. Day 251 brought a heat so intense that the compound's atmospheric regulators struggled to maintain breathable air. 48 degrees Celsius in the shade. There was no shade. Carter and 30 other prisoners were assigned to dig defensive trenches 12 hours daily. His hands, already scarred from cold burns and repeated trauma, blistered and bled within the first hour. By hour 6, he was working with raw flesh. By hour 9, his vision blurred from dehydration and heat stroke. He'd lost 22 kilograms since capture. His body was consuming itself to survive. But he kept digging. A Threx guard, watching through heat shimmer, reported to Roskel that evening. Subject H247 demonstrated impaired cognitive function but continued labor without prompting. This persistence lacks survival logic. Hypothesis: human neural structure processes pain signals differently than predicted. Roskel reviewed the biometric data. Carter's core temperature had reached 41 degrees. The threshold for permanent brain damage in humans was 42. He'd been operating within 1 degree of catastrophic failure for 11 hours. And the next day, Carter woke up and returned to the trenches. On day 267, the Threx tried something novel. They placed another human in Carter's cell, same uniform, same build, similar facial structure. The plant introduced himself as Lieutenant Marcus Shaw, claimed to be from the same Marine Division, captured 3 weeks ago during a skirmish in the Outer Rim. Carter spent 6 hours talking with Shaw, sharing stories about Earth, about the war, about the particular way Texas barbecue smoke smelled on a summer evening. Shaw knew all the right references, laughed at all the right jokes, and something felt wrong. On the 7th hour, Carter asked a simple question. What was our drill instructor's favorite saying? Shaw smiled. The only easy day was yesterday. That's Navy SEALs, Carter said quietly. Our DI's favorite was pain is weakness leaving the body. You failed the test. Shaw, or whatever the Threx had engineered him to be, stopped smiling. Within minutes, guards removed him. Carter sat alone in his cell, shaking not from cold, but from the realization of how close he'd come to trusting. To believing he wasn't alone. That night, he didn't sing. He sat in silence, processing how thoroughly they'd tried to infiltrate not just his body, but his memories, his identity, his last connection to home. Roskel logged the event with clinical precision, but his notes included an addendum he'd never added before. Subject's ability to detect deception suggests cultural knowledge creates verification systems beyond biochemical analysis. Human social bonds may be more sophisticated than previously documented. On day 289, Carter witnessed something that would haunt his nightmares forever. A Gorland prisoner, the same one who'd shared water with him on day 73, was executed in the compound yard. Public demonstration. Vex Thul's stated purpose: remind prisoners of their position. They made Carter watch, made all prisoners watch. The Gorland's name was Thirsk. He'd been caught attempting to dig an escape tunnel, 30 meters in 8 months, using nothing but his claws and patience. Thirsk died with his eyes open, looking at the sky. No final words, just defiant silence. Carter cried openly. The Threx guards noted it as evidence of breaking. But Carter wasn't breaking. He was remembering, adding another name to his wall, another reason to keep breathing. Because if he gave up, who would remember Thirsk? Who would tell his story? Roskel watched the execution from the command center, unable to look away. He'd been the one who discovered the tunnel during routine inspection. His report had led directly to Thirsk's death. And for the first time in his life, Roskel questioned whether following protocol was the same as doing right. He spent that night reading human philosophical texts from the galactic database. Concepts like moral injury, complicity, the weight of choices. The Threx had no equivalent frameworks. You obeyed or you rebelled. There was no space in between for the gray zone of reluctant participation in systems you couldn't change. But Carter existed in that gray zone constantly, choosing which battles to fight, which indignities to resist, and which to absorb, making impossible calculations about survival versus identity dozens of times daily. On day 302, something unexpected happened. Carter received legitimate intelligence. A guard, exhausted and careless, left a datapad visible for 90 seconds. Carter saw casualty reports. Human forces were winning in 3 sectors. The Earth hadn't fallen. The war continued. He couldn't verify it. Couldn't be certain it wasn't another psychological operation. But that night, his singing had a different quality. Less desperation, more defiance. The Zethian prisoners noticed, started clicking their approval. The infection of hope spread through the compound like a virus the Threx couldn't quarantine. By day 312, the compound exploded with violence. Not Carter's doing. Other prisoners, emboldened by whispers and stolen intelligence, attempted a coordinated breakout. It failed within 30 minutes. 17 prisoners died. Carter wasn't involved, but he suffered the collective punishment anyway. 3 weeks in solitary confinement. The same 2-meter cell. Complete darkness. This time with minimal water and no food. Carter emerged on day 333 looking like a corpse. His ribs visible through prison-thin clothing, his skin drawn tight, his eyes hollow. Medical scans showed organ stress approaching critical thresholds. And yet when Roskel asked if he needed medical intervention, Carter waved him off. "I've been through worse," he lied, because admitting weakness felt like surrender. The lie was obvious. The determination behind it was terrifying. On day 356, everything changed. Roskel made a choice. During morning rounds, while discussing philosophical concepts Carter had explained weeks earlier, Roskel asked, "Your concept of free will. You believe individuals can choose outside hierarchical determination?" "Every damn day," Carter said. "Even when choice leads to suffering?" "Especially then. Easy choices aren't really choices at all." Roskel was silent for 30 seconds. Then he did something that violated every protocol, every training, every instinct of Threx culture. He opened Carter's food ration container and doubled the contents, in plain view of security cameras. "That is my choice," Roskel said. Within 3 hours, Roskel was arrested, his rank stripped, his scientific credentials suspended. He was declared a sympathizer, a collaborator, a failure of Threx conditioning. They moved him from the guard quarters to the prisoner compound. Carter found him on day 358, sitting in a cell 3 meters from his own. Roskel's scales looked dull, his posture defeated. "I'm sorry," Carter said through the bars. Roskel's head turned slowly. "Don't be. For the first time in my life, I chose something. Not because command required it, not because protocol dictated it, because it felt correct. Your language has a word for that. Right. I chose right over rank. That takes more courage than you know. Or perhaps I'm simply contaminated. Your species appears to be contagious." Carter laughed, a harsh bark of sound that made Roskel's scales ripple. "Welcome to humanity, Ross. It's going to suck." "It already does." "Yeah, but at least you'll die as yourself." They sat in adjacent cells as the temperature began its nightly drop. Two beings from opposite sides of an evolutionary divide, finding common ground in the simple act of choosing dignity over survival. On day 371, the compound's rhythm changed. The war beyond the walls was shifting. Guards rotated more frequently. Supply deliveries became irregular. Rumors spread through the prison network about Threx civil conflict, faction warfare, resources diverted from border systems. Carter and Roskel, now cell neighbors, talked through long nights about what happens after. If rescue came, if the war ended, if either of them survived to see it. "Your people will hate me," Roskel said on day 385. "I wore the uniform, I followed orders, I watched you suffer." "You made a choice when it mattered," Carter countered. "That counts for something." "Does it?" "I still participated, still enabled. Choosing right at the end doesn't erase the middle." Carter had no answer for that, because Roskel was right. Redemption didn't work like mathematics. You couldn't balance an equation of suffering with a single act of kindness. But you could try. You could choose differently going forward. "We'll figure it out," Carter said finally, "if we live." Day 3. 190 brought distant explosions. The compound shook with concussive force. Guards shouted contradictory orders. Sirens wailed. The machines, running constantly for 390 days, finally went silent. Carter and Roskel exchanged looks through their cell bars. "That sounds like bombardment," Roskel said. "That sounds like opportunity," Carter replied. The compound's power grid failed at 1700 hours. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in red. In the sudden quiet, Carter could hear things he'd been deaf to for months: breathing, movement, the whisper of hope spreading through cells like wind through grass. "What do we do?" Roskel asked. Carter's response was simple. "We survive, just like every other day. Except this time, maybe we get to choose what survival looks like." The explosions grew closer. And Carter, who'd endured 390 days through nothing but stubborn refusal to quit, allowed himself something he hadn't felt since Signia IV. The dangerous luxury of hope that didn't sound like lying to himself. Outside, the galaxy burned. Inside, a human and a Threx sat in adjacent cells and prepared for whatever came next. Day 394 changed everything. The explosion that shattered Carter's cell wall came at 0300 hours. Not from bombardment. From internal sabotage. A faction of Threx prisoners, guards who defected during the civil war raging beyond the compound, had decided to burn the whole system down. Carter woke to the taste of smoke and the sound of screaming. His damaged hearing made everything seem underwater, distant. But the heat was immediate and real. The wall to his right had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a hole large enough to crawl through. Beyond it, the forest. Alien trees with purple bark and leaves that glowed faintly in the dark. A path to survival, to escape, to freedom. Behind him, screaming. The compound was on fire, prisoners trapped in cells, guards fighting prisoners fighting each other. Total chaos. Carter stood at the hole in his wall for exactly 8 seconds, long enough to calculate that his odds of survival in that forest were maybe 50-50. Long enough to hear someone screaming for help in a language he'd learned meant, "Water. Water, please." Long enough to make a choice. He turned away from freedom and ran toward the fire. The Zethian prisoner, the one who'd laughed at his jokes 300 days ago, was trapped under a collapsed beam. Carter's hands, already scarred and damaged, burned as he lifted the metal. He got the Zethian out. Then he heard more screaming. 4 prisoners, 3 different species, all trapped in cells whose electronic locks had failed in the closed position during the power failure. Carter used the same metal beam as a lever, prying doors open one by one. His hands bled. His partially deaf ears missed the warning shout when a section of roof collapsed 3 meters behind him. He kept moving on pure momentum and something that looked like insanity but felt like purpose. On the 5th door, he found Roskel. Not trapped by a failed lock but by a Threx guard, Commander Vex Thul's second, who'd decided that sympathizers deserved execution before the camp fell. The guard had a plasma rifle pointed at Roskel's head. Carter had a piece of scrap metal and 22 kilograms less mass than when he'd arrived. The mathematics were clear. So Carter did something magnificently stupid. He charged. He didn't win through combat prowess. He won because the guard hadn't expected a human prisoner, starved and injured, to just not care about the plasma rifle. Carter hit him low and hard, and they went down in a tangle. The rifle discharged into the ceiling. Burning metal rained down. Carter's hands found a rock. Desperation found momentum. The guard stopped moving. Carter stood, swaying. Roskel stared at him with all 6 eyes wide. "You're insane," Roskel said. "No," Carter gasped. "Just stubborn." They stumbled through smoke and flame, gathering prisoners as they went. By the time they reached the compound center, Carter had 30 beings following him. Species he could name and species he'd never seen. All looking to the human who'd chosen to run toward fire instead of away from it. The problem was immediately apparent. The main gate was sealed, designed to withstand bombardment. The compound walls were 3 meters of reinforced composite. And in the center, still operational on emergency power, sat the primary generator. The system that controlled the locks, the barriers, every security measure. Commander Vex Thul's voice crackled through failing speakers. "Prisoners will return to cells immediately. Resistance will be met with lethal force. You are surrounded." He wasn't wrong. 60 seconds until Threx security drones arrived. 90 seconds until the entire compound locked down permanently. Carter looked at the generator. Looked at the prisoners behind him. Looked at Roskel. "I have a really bad idea," Carter said. "Those seem to be your specialty." In the maintenance shed, Carter found exactly what he needed. Industrial fuel cells, power coupling cables, and a basic detonator from a mining charge. His hands, trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline, assembled something that a proper engineer would have called catastrophically unsafe. Carter called it good enough. Roskel watched with fascination and horror. "You understand this has a 90% chance of killing you?" "Yeah, but a 100% chance of freeing them." Carter nodded toward the prisoners huddled behind cover. "Math's easy. That's not logical." Carter smiled his trademark impossible smile. "Welcome to humanity, Ross." They carried the improvised explosive to the generator. Security drones were now visible, 60 meters and closing. Roskel grabbed a broken plasma rifle, providing cover fire that was more suppressive than accurate. Carter armed the device. Vex Thul's voice cut through the chaos. "You're surrounded. Surrender or die." Carter looked at the generator. At the compound he'd survived for 397 days. At the symbol carved in the ground, barely visible through smoke. At Roskel, scales scorched, fighting beside him. He thought about his grandmother's funeral. Amazing grace echoing through a Texas chapel. He thought about the 14 humans who died before him. About Thirsk and the Gorland's defiant eyes. about every prisoner who'd shared water or sung off-key or simply survived another day because someone else chose to keep going. Carter pressed the detonator trigger. Red light started flashing. 30 seconds. "Run," he told the prisoners. They ran. Carter stood his ground, making sure the generator wouldn't be disarmed, wouldn't fail. 20 seconds. Roskel grabbed his arm. "Carter, move. Need to make sure. I don't care about sure. I care about you living." 15 seconds. Carter felt something crack inside his chest. Not ribs. Something deeper. The realization that someone, after all this, gave a damn whether he survived. That mattering to someone made survival matter differently. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, let's go." They ran. 10 seconds. 5, 3. The generator exploded. The blast wave threw them 15 meters. Carter's world became fire and pressure and the taste of copper. His ears, already damaged, registered the explosion as a wall of silence. He hit the ground hard enough to crack ribs he couldn't spare to break. Above them, the compound's central tower collapsed. The walls, losing power, began to fail. The gate, sealed for 397 days, slowly ground open. Prisoners poured through into the alien forest, into the chaos of a civil war, into uncertainty that beat certainty of death. Carter lay on his back, staring up at a purple-black sky. Roskel's face appeared above him, mouth moving. Carter couldn't hear the words through the ringing silence, but he read the shape of them. "Stay with me. Stay awake." He tried. He really did. But 400 days of not quite enough food, not quite enough water, not quite enough sleep suddenly sent their bill. His vision tunneled. His body, having finally completed its mission, decided it was done fighting. The last thing Carter saw was Roskel's face, scales torn and bloodied, dragging him away from the flames. The last thing he thought was, "I kept count. 400 days. I won the bet." Then darkness, warm and absolute, took him. He didn't see the human rescue forces arrive 4 hours later. Didn't see Roskel refusing to leave his side even when soldiers pointed weapons. Didn't see the 30 prisoners, bearing witness, explaining in a dozen languages that the human and the Threx were together, were friends, had saved them all. Didn't see the medic's face when she checked his vitals and whispered, "How is he alive?" Didn't hear Roskel's response, because he's human, and humans don't know when to quit. But somewhere in the darkness between living and whatever came after, Miles Carter heard singing, his grandmother's voice, his mother's. Every person he'd ever loved, every Marine he'd served with, every prisoner who'd shared a cell or a song. They sang and the sound was beautiful, and Carter thought, "I'm not done yet." His heart kept beating, and in a medical transport 3 hours later, racing toward a field hospital, Carter finally opened his eyes. A human doctor leaned over him, checking readings. "Welcome back, Marine," she said. "You've been out for a while." Carter's voice was barely a whisper. "How long?" 4 days since rescue. Your file says you were in that camp for..." She checked her tablet. 400 days, exactly. Carter's lips moved. The doctor leaned closer to hear. "I win," he whispered. Then smiled. Then slept the first peaceful sleep he'd had since Cygna IV. Outside the medical bay, Roskel stood under guard, scales dulled from exhaustion, watching the human sleep through a transparent panel. A human officer approached, weapon holstered, but present. "You're Threx." "I was," Roskel said quietly. "Now I'm not sure what I am." "He defended you, the prisoner. Woke up screaming about not shooting his friend. That means something. It means he's more human than most humans pretend to be." The officer considered this. "For what it's worth, Observer Roskel, your testimony helped us understand what happened in there. The 30 prisoners you both saved corroborated everything. Command wants to debrief you, but they've granted temporary asylum." Roskel nodded slowly, then asked the question that had haunted him for 200 days. What do you call someone who spent 300 days enforcing suffering before choosing differently? What word do humans have for that? The officer was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, we're still figuring that out ourselves. But Carter thinks you're worth trusting. So until he says different, you're under our protection. In the medical bay, Carter slept. And for the first time in 400 days, he didn't dream of machines grinding, of cold that burned, of hunger that hollowed. He dreamed of Texas and coffee and his niece's 17 exact hugs. He dreamed of coming home. 3 weeks after the compound fell, Corporal Miles Carter sat in a hospital bed at Alliance Medical Station Kepler 7, staring out at a view of stars he'd thought he'd never see again. His body was a catalog of permanent damage. The medical report, which he'd read twice because it still felt surreal, listed everything with clinical precision. 38% hearing loss in his left ear, severe arthritis in both knees and shoulders from repeated cold exposure, PTSD with acute auditory triggers, 27 kilograms lost, 7 ribs with healed fractures, and nerve damage in both hands that caused tremors whenever he tried fine motor tasks. The career he'd built was over. The Corps couldn't deploy a Marine who shook when trying to field strip a rifle. Couldn't send someone into combat when certain sounds triggered panic responses he couldn't control. But he was alive. That counted for something. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the same doctor who'd been on the rescue team, reviewed his charts with the kind of careful professionalism that couldn't quite hide concern. "Your psychological eval came back," she said. "You're cleared for discharge in 2 days, but we recommend ongoing therapy. Trauma like this doesn't just heal because you want it to." "I know." "Do you?" She sat down, tablet aside, meeting his eyes. "Marines are trained to push through. But pushing through trauma just buries it. It doesn't resolve it." Carter looked at his hands, at the tremor he couldn't quite control. "I kept track of every day. 400 exactly. Made marks on the wall. Repeated names so I wouldn't forget the people who died. Sang songs so I'd remember what being human felt like. I did everything right to survive. You did. But survival isn't the same as living." Before Carter could respond, there was a knock. Ross Kell stood in the doorway, escorted by a human guard who looked uncomfortable but professional. The Threx's scales were still duller than they should be, a physical manifestation of stress that translated across species. Dr. Vasquez stood. "I'll give you two some time." To the guard, "He's cleared for unsupervised visits." The guard nodded and stepped back, leaving Carter and Roskell alone. They sat in silence for 30 seconds, then both spoke at once. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." They stopped. Carter laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "You first." Roskell's head tilted in that characteristic gesture of processing complexity. "I wanted to apologize. For the 300 days before I chose differently. For every moment I documented your suffering without intervening. For being complicit in a system designed to break you." Carter was quiet for a long moment. "You made a choice when it mattered. That's what I'll remember. But does that erase what came before? No. But it gives what came before a different ending. You were Threx, following orders, doing your job. Then you met a stubborn human who wouldn't break, and it made you question everything. That's not nothing, Ross. My superiors called it contamination, said I was psychologically compromised. Good. The Threx need more compromised people. Maybe if they'd had them earlier, we wouldn't have fought a war." Roskell's scales rippled with something that might have been amusement. "The Threx High Command has requested my extradition for trial. Charges of treason and collaboration with enemy forces." Carter's expression hardened. "Over my dead body. That can be arranged," Roskell said dryly. Then, more seriously, "Your alliance granted me political asylum. Temporary, pending a full investigation, but asylum nonetheless. I believe the phrase your legal officer used was that my cooperation was instrumental in understanding Threx detention protocols and might prevent future incidents." Translation. They want to pick your brain about how your side thinks. Essentially, I'm told I'll be giving testimony before the Alliance War Crimes Tribunal in 6 months. I'll be there to testify for you. Roskel's 6 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of genuine surprise. You would do that? You saved my life, Ross. Pulled me away from an explosion I was too stubborn to run from. Yeah, I'll testify. I'll tell them exactly what I saw. Someone who made the hardest choice possible and paid for it. The door opened again. A human officer in Alliance uniform entered, her insignia marking her as a captain. She nodded respectfully at both of them. Corporal Carter, Observer Roskel. I'm Captain Morrison, Alliance Intelligence. I apologize for the interruption, but I have news that concerns you both. She pulled up a holographic display. 3 days ago, the Alliance and the Threx Empire signed a preliminary ceasefire agreement. Fighting hasn't stopped everywhere, but official hostilities have suspended pending formal negotiations. Carter felt his breath catch. The war's over. Ending. There's a difference. But yes, we're moving toward peace. Morrison's expression softened. Your case, Corporal, became something of a catalyst. The 30 prisoners you freed included representatives from 8 different species, all of whom filed testimony with their respective governments. Your survival and your testimony about Threx detention practices gave the Alliance leverage in negotiations. She turned to Roskel. And your defection, Observer, along with your detailed documentation of camp operations, helped us understand Threx military culture in ways that made negotiation possible. Your people respect strength. You demonstrated that choosing principle over hierarchy is its own form of strength. Roskel processed this carefully. So my betrayal of the Empire helped end the war? Your choice to follow conscience over command helped create a path to peace. Whether that's betrayal or evolution is a matter of perspective. After Morrison left, Carter and Roskel sat in silence again, processing the weight of unintended consequences. 400 days of suffering had rippled outward into something neither could have predicted. The humans have a word I've been learning, Roskel said finally. Friend. I believe I understand it now. It means someone you choose to stand beside even when logic suggests otherwise. Carter smiled. That's pretty much it, yeah. Then I would like to ask, am I your friend? Carter extended his trembling right hand. Roskel looked at it, then carefully wrapped 3 clawed fingers around it. The gesture was awkward, cross-species, and imperfect. It was also one of the most human things either of them had ever done. Yeah, Ross, you're my friend. 2 days later, Carter was discharged. The ceremony was small. A handful of Marines from his unit, Dr. Vasquez, Captain Morrison, and Roskel. Carter received a medical discharge with full honors, a Purple Heart, and a commendation for conduct beyond the call of duty. When they pinned the medal to his uniform, Carter thought about the 14 names on a wall he'd never see again. Thought about Thirsk's defiant eyes. Thought about every prisoner who'd sung songs they barely understood because a stubborn human had decided culture was worth preserving in hell. The commanding officer's speech was formal, proper, and entirely inadequate to capture what 400 days actually meant. But at the end, he added something off script. Corporal Carter demonstrated something we often forget, that strength isn't just about firepower or tactics. Sometimes it's about refusing to become what suffering wants you to be, about choosing who you are every single day, even when every day is designed to break you. That's the kind of Marine we're proud to serve beside. 3 months after that, Carter and Roskel both testified before the Alliance War Crimes Tribunal. The proceedings were broadcast across 30 star systems. Carter's testimony, describing the daily choice to remain human despite systematic dehumanization, was quoted in diplomatic channels for years afterward. Roskel's testimony, explaining how observing human resilience had forced him to question fundamental assumptions about strength, became required reading in Alliance military academies. The concept was eventually formalized in interspecies relations doctrine as the Carter factor. the psychological phenomenon where human persistence through suffering forces observers to question their own values. The Threx Empire issued a formal apology 6 months later, though implementation of reform would take years. Commander Vex Thul was tried by his own people for crimes against captured personnel. Raskel's permanent asylum was granted, and on a cool evening 2 years after the compound fell, Carter sat on a porch in Texas, coffee in trembling hands, watching his niece play in the yard. She was 6 now. She still demanded exactly 17 hugs. Some things didn't change. Raskel sat beside him, scales gleaming in Earth's yellow sun, struggling with the concept of humidity, but determined to experience what Carter had described in that cell so long ago. "This is home?" Raskel asked. "This is home," Carter confirmed. "It's peaceful. Yeah, boring even. Exactly what I fought to get back to." They sat in companionable silence. Two beings who'd survived hell through the simple act of refusing to let it define them. The war was over. The physical wounds had healed as much as they would. The psychological wounds were being addressed slowly, through therapy and time and the patient work of rebuilding. Carter still heard the machines sometimes, still woke up counting days, still made marks on paper without thinking, keeping track of time as if forgetting might mean being trapped again. But he was home. He was alive. And he had a friend who'd chosen him over an empire. That was enough. "Hey, Ross," Carter said suddenly. "Want to hear something my grandmother used to say? Always. She said that being unbreakable doesn't mean you never crack. It means you keep choosing to hold together even when the cracks show, even when it hurts, even when giving up would be easier." Raskel considered this. "Your grandmother was wise. She was stubborn. It's the family trait. I've noticed." They watched the sun set over Texas, purple-black sky replaced by orange-gold earth tones, and Carter thought about the names on a wall in a compound that no longer existed. He'd commissioned a memorial, privately funded. 47 names. The 14 who'd died before him, Thirsk and the others who'd fallen during his time, and even some Threx guards who'd tried to do right in an impossible system. Because being human, Carter had learned, meant remembering. Meant carrying the weight of every choice and every name and every moment that mattered. It wasn't logical. It wasn't efficient. But it was who they were. And after 400 days of proving that humanity couldn't be broken, Carter had come to understand something profound. They weren't unbreakable because they were strong. They were unbreakable because they chose to be every single day, even when every day was hard. Especially when every day was hard. "You know what the best part about being home is?" Carter asked. "Tell me." "Nobody's counting days anymore. Nobody's trying to take away who I am. I just get to exist. As me, on my terms." He raised his coffee cup. "To choosing, Russ, every damn day." Raskel raised his water glass. "To choosing, and to stubborn humans who teach the galaxy that logic isn't everything." They drank. The sun set. And somewhere in the distance, Carter's niece laughed, the sound carrying on the Texas wind like a song he'd never forget. 400 days had tried to break him. 400 days had failed, and in the end, that stubborn, impossible, magnificently human refusal to quit had changed more than just one man's life. It had helped end a war. That, Carter thought, was worth every scar. In a galaxy that measured power by domination, one human proved that strength could be silence, and victory could be simply not becoming what tried to break you. Miles Carter didn't win through violence or genius. He won by remembering who he was, day after day, when everything around him demanded that he forget. Because that's what humanity is, at its core. Not perfection, not logic, but the stubborn, impossible refusal to surrender what makes us us. What would you have done in his place? Run for freedom, or turn back for those still burning? Do you think survival means endurance? Or choosing to stay human even when it hurts? What's stronger? The instinct to live, or the will to remain yourself? If this story reminded you that true power is choosing who you are, write the word stubbornness in the comments, just to show you stayed until the end. Tell me, from which city or planet are you watching? Subscribe if you believe stories like this remind us what we're still capable of. Like, share, and click on the next story. Another tale of what it truly means to be human among the stars.